Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Malika Gauthier from Pro's marketing team, and in today's session, we are going to talk about how to break down the 5 common barriers of a pricing software project. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. So the first one is that this session will last 30 minutes and we will have a live Q&A at the end. So you can ask your questions all throughout the webinar in the Q&A panel and we will make sure to address them. And also we are recording this session and we will send it with all of you within the next 2 days. So your host today is Nick Boyer. Nick is Pro's Senior Director of Strategy Consulting, and he has more than 15 years of experience helping companies achieve commercial excellence. Nick has been helping a lot of different businesses transform their pricing and commercial processes, and he helped them generate a very amazing ROI in a lot of different industries, including in chemicals, in oil and gas, in food, technology, and also industrial manufacturing and distribution. And Nick is also a regular speaker at pricing conferences and events throughout Europe, where you might have had the chance to meet with him. Okay, well, with that, Nick, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Malika. And welcome to this, effectively the second in a 2-part webinar. So at Pros, we discuss pricing initiatives, pricing projects with many companies. And we've come across some common barriers that sometimes either completely get in the way or delay, kind of preventing companies from moving forward to realize the value of pricing initiatives. Some of those barriers are valid and need to be overcome, and some can actually be quite easily overcome and are not really the barriers that they were initially perceived to be. So we thought we'd share our experience and thoughts on this over 2 webinars. And the 8 most common barriers that we've come across are on the screen here, displayed here. And in the last webinar, we covered the first 3. So in this one, we're going to tackle the remaining 5. We're going to look at the things that we need to consider to determine if each of these is a true barrier or something that we can overcome. We'll discuss in general terms what needs to be considered and look at some specific examples where we've helped companies overcome some of these issues. And so they are convincing senior stakeholders of the importance of the pricing initiative and supporting the pricing initiative, the impact on IT, any kind of data quality issues or concerns about data quality, concerns about getting the right level of user adoption, and other initiatives taking priority and therefore our pricing initiative not being able to get underway. So let's start with how do we get our projects onto the corporate agenda? Because obviously if we can't do that, then the rest of it kind of isn't really relevant anyway. So most companies have finite resources. They've got a limited number of people, a limited budget, even kind of a limited capacity for the amount of change that they can undertake at any one moment in time. So there tends to be some form of project portfolio management taking place. So some companies have very formal processes around this. In other companies, it's more informal. But generally, there is some form of assessment of projects. And in order to get our projects underway, they need to be justified versus other competing projects. To give our projects the best chance of being considered, we need to make sure that we prepare the ground by answering a number of questions that companies ask themselves when prioritizing projects. And the first one is, does the project align with business strategy? It's an obvious one, an obvious place to start. We need to be able to clearly articulate how our project ties in with the corporate strategy. Now, as we go through this presentation, we're going to use Company X as our generic company to talk about real-life examples, because we're not allowed to use actual company names. And the pricing manager in Company X came to us because she had been challenged by her CFO. She was being challenged to deliver another 1.5% of revenue on top of what her new pricing strategies were forecast to deliver, so the business could meet their target objectives. And we identified with her that our AI-driven price recommendations, predicting willingness to pay, and optimizing revenue and margin would help drive better price realization and help her achieve this additional 1.5% of revenue down to the bottom line. So there was already a clear link to corporate goals, and there's already a buy-in from the CFO, or he was the first person that really needed convincing. But other common ways of linking price initiatives into corporate strategy that we've seen over the last couple of years have been, a desire to grow the e-commerce business, a desire to move to value-based selling, a desire to move to other different business models, and over the last few years, of course, a strategy to address inflation and the kind of volatile cost basis. Now, if having many projects competing for resources, the next obvious question is, how does the ROI and business value compare one project versus the other? So we need to make an educated guess of both tangible and intangible benefits. And with Company X, we ran the algorithm. So we basically took their sales transactions and we ran our AI algorithm, and we're able to estimate the revenue uplift that they would get using their actual data and their current levels of pricing. So this gave us an idea of the revenue uplift and therefore the kind of the additional margin that they would achieve by implementing the project. But we also looked at not just the tangible value that the project would deliver, but also the intangible things. So things being able to get quotes approved quicker, being able to get quotes out of the door quicker, and the kind of more intangible benefits that would come with some of those kind of other areas of value that the pricing initiative was going to deliver. And then finally, we used all of this to calculate a return on investment and also a cash flow analysis. So there was a clear understanding of the return on investment that the project would get over its 3-year period and when it would start to hit a positive cash flow. But of course, sometimes projects don't need a return on investment. They can also just be enablers for other projects that will deliver the main business value. For example, projects to align master data across the company is an example of an enabling project that hasn't necessarily got a return on investment on its own, but it's a clear, important enabler for a lot of other projects that a company may want to execute. And then we need to ask ourselves, are the required resources available? Because even projects with a good return on investment need resources available to make them successful. Pricing initiatives and pricing projects tend to be led by pricing teams, and often it's pricing teams that need to commit a significant amount of resource to make them happen and make them successful. But sometimes sales are also impacted and they need training. For example, if we're introducing value-based selling, or in the case of Company X, where we've got new pricing recommendations that we want to be adopted. So we need to consider the impact on the sales team. And obviously, of course, we frequently need some resources from IT too, something that we're going to get back to and talk in a little bit more detail later. So we need to make sure that we identify the resources that are going to be impacted by our pricing initiative and make sure that there are no other major initiatives or workloads that are going to be conflicting with our initiative during the proposed timelines. And finally, we need to consider all major likely risks and how to mitigate them. This will then help us in the conversations that we have with key stakeholders to get our project off the ground, get our project underway. And it also provides it always proves useful to think about risks and mitigations as early as possible, so that we're kind of armed with that thinking when we have these discussions with stakeholders as we move through the different life cycles of our project. And of course, like risk identification and risk mitigation is an ongoing exercise throughout a whole project life cycle. So the next kind of key barrier is convincing senior stakeholders that our pricing initiative is the one that deserves priority and deserves to kind of get underway. And the first step in convincing skeptical stakeholders is to have a thought-through, conservative business case supported by a realistic risk analysis, as we've already just discussed. But we don't just want to rely on the business case calculation. It's also important to, at this early stage, share success stories to help get stakeholders on board. This helps kind of build confidence. And these can initially be from maybe peers that we've met at other companies at pricing conferences, sharing their experiences. It could be customer stories we've received from software vendors, and it could be information and context that we've got from independent thought leaders, external consultants. And then once the project is underway, the success stories should be coming from the initial pilot and from the great news that we're generating ourselves internally from our project. And the next important question is, do I have an executive sponsor, and is it the right executive sponsor? Because the right executive sponsor can influence other senior stakeholders for us. So we need to try and get somebody with the right attributes. Someone that's got the right level of authority, the right level of influence within the organization, is visible and accessible to us, the project team, and the other stakeholders. Of course, needs to share the strategic vision of what we're trying to achieve, and of course have good communication skills as well. And one of the best examples in my experience was actually a CEO that was the executive sponsor, and he was highly visible throughout the project. He came to the project kickoff, and he recorded little videos of why it was a strategic imperative for the business, videos that we could use at lots of different phases during the project just to help emphasize the importance and the senior level buy-in that the project had. So it's important to choose the right executive sponsor. And then, as part of any good change management plan, we obviously need to identify the main stakeholders that are going to be impacted by our project and uncover their needs. And we need to understand their needs. We need to understand their concerns. We need to build relationships with the senior stakeholders. We need to, where appropriate, involve them in the process. And we need to make sure that we employ our listening skills to make sure that we truly do understand their concerns, and then show the flexibility to address those concerns kind of where they're valid. And if we return to company X, an example of a skeptical stakeholder there was their data science lead. He was worried about losing control and relying on something that he didn't yet fully understand. So we had to do a number of things to allay his fears, his kind of valid concerns. So first of all, we arranged a deep dive with our data scientists to explain the underlying technology in more detail. We demonstrated that through the UI, the data scientist will be a key user and will be able to add attributes and change the recommendations independently of pros. And finally, we arranged for a conversation with an existing customer that we'd used during our beta testing of the new neural network AI solution, so that he could hear from their data scientist about the significant improvements in prediction accuracy that they'd achieved. So the takeaway is really to identify the stakeholders, understand their concerns, listen, and then try and come up with good imaginative plans to address those concerns so we can get our project underway. The next thing to consider is the impact on IT. So there are, of course, one of the critical stakeholders in their own right, and we need to listen to their concerns and address them. And so the first question to ask ourselves is IT actually busy working on other priorities and therefore won't have time during the envisaged timelines of our pricing initiative? And of course, this is where the portfolio management comes in. So if we have an organization that is prioritizing the projects according to their return on investment, their importance to the strategic goals, etc., then it's kind of fair enough if IT are working on other priorities that come higher than our pricing initiative when all those things have been taken into account. But if they're working on other initiatives that are of lower priority, then we need to talk to the right people and show them our return on investment, show them our business case, our reason for why our pricing initiative is more important, and therefore we need to free up those IT resources. Or potentially we can also maybe look at using external resources because they can be sometimes used effectively, because pricing initiatives don't always have a huge impact on the IT departments. And that's the next thing really we need to consider is our IT architecture compatible with what we want to achieve with our pricing initiative? We need to involve IT in these discussions. Typically there's a company architect, so we can come up with an understanding of how the new initiatives will fit into the existing architecture. Identify the applications involved and the data flows that are going to be between them, and make sure that any IT policies are complied with when it comes to, for example, business continuity, permitted technologies, methods of integration, etc. And often the implications are not as significant as IT may kind of initially fear once we go through this exercise. So, for example, again, if we go back to Company X, you can see on screen here that really all we needed to generate our pricing recommendations was sales transactions, their product master with the associated attributes, customer master with the associated attributes, and product costs, all things that were readily available in their existing ERP system. And then in terms of the integration into their quoting system, they needed to call an API to get the pricing guidance. So once we have that level of understanding of how our initiative impacts the IT landscape, it's easier to then determine, do we have the right IT skills that are required? As I said, for the majority of pricing initiatives, there is no requirement to change existing applications. In a lot of cases, it's generally just integration skills that are required. And usually companies have some form of ETL tool available and IT resources that already have the skills to use them. Or alternatively, it's easy to find temporary IT resources to help with those types of kind of integration topics if necessary. But more and more, it's also important for IT to ensure that their corporate security policies are adhered to. This is typically something we need to uncover with IT departments early on in the process. They typically have questionnaires, policies that need to be adhered to. And so again, in the case of Company X, we were able to put them in front of our technical resources to help them answer all the relevant questions that they had on their standard checklist and confirm that from Pro's perspective, we had all the relevant certifications to give them the assurance that they needed to give them then the confidence to go to their C-level executives and confirm and kind of buy into this project being a good idea and not compromising any IT policies, any IT security. And then the next key barrier to consider is data quality. And the first obvious question is our data fit for purpose? Have we gathered the key data required to support our pricing initiative? And different pricing initiatives obviously require different levels of data. If we're looking at introducing value-based pricing, we're going to need to have identified the product value drivers. We will need to have quantified the value adders to put against those value drivers. If we're looking at implementing market-based pricing, we'll have needed to identify the relevant competitors that we want to benchmark ourselves against. We need to be able to collect those competitor prices, and we need to be able to map the competitor products to our products. And finally, if we're, for example, looking at AI price guidance, then we need those things that we saw in the slide earlier. We need sales transactions, product attributes, and customer attributes, all things that are actually readily available and already existing in most companies' ERP systems. So we don't need perfect data across the entire business to get going. We just need to make sure that we've got the right data for the specific initial scope that we've identified to get going with, that will deliver our quick early wins and kind of drive momentum for our pricing initiative. Then the next question is, we need to ask is our data consistent across the organization? So more and more companies have common ERP systems implementations in place globally. But we still come across companies where maybe there's different ERP systems in place in different geographies, maybe different instances of the same ERP system. And the key thing to watch out for there is if the data is inconsistent from one ERP to the other. So for example, on the screen here, having a product master with different levels, and even having a product, the same product with one ID in one ERP system and a completely different one in another ERP system. Then it becomes almost impossible to introduce common pricing processes when this is the case. And we have seen kind of cases where this is a legitimate reason to delay a pricing initiative and instead kick off a project to map all the company's data into one common data structure as an enabler for a pricing initiative to get going. Then the next question is our data complete and accurate? And what are the consequences if it's not? You know, can we implement some mitigations? For example, if we want to move to competitor-based pricing, we can use a try in order when we execute our pricing strategies, so that if we haven't got the latest competitor price shot, we can instead fall back onto our previous pricing strategy, which maybe was cost plus. In the case of using AI to generate pricing recommendations, the great thing about neural networks is it will find the best fit, the best pricing recommendation based on the attributes that we're feeding into the model. So if we've got some missing in some cases, it's not that important because it will just use the ones available to still come up with the best possible price based on what we've got available. So really, whether the data is complete or accurate and whether we can still get going will really depend on the extent of the inaccuracies, the extent of incompletions. But I guess the key message is it doesn't need to be perfect, because we can also have put some mitigations in place to deal with less than perfect data. And then the final thing that we need to consider is, can our data be integrated? So again, if we go back to Company X as an example, we ran their data through our cloud utility to highlight any issues. Because there are always various rules to adhere to when integrating into other applications. So we were able to check things like whether there were any null values, any unique descriptions, unique dimension levels, parent-child issues, date format issues, any referential integrity issues. So that's, for example, where you've got sales transactions that identify a product and a customer. Those products and customers need to be available in your product and customer master. And these types of issues don't need to be showstoppers. The cloud utility very quickly highlights where the issues are, and they can quickly be fixed as long as there's an appropriate resources available to get going to fix these issues. And then finally, we need to ensure our data can be updated when it needs to be. So, for example, if we are doing competitor pricing, we need a mechanism for refreshing the competitive price collection to be in place. And we need that refresh to happen in line with our pricing strategy and how often we need to react to competitor price changes. And then the final barrier to consider is user adoption. And the first question to ask is, do we have a change management competency that matches the ambitions of our pricing initiative? So if our initiative is to change e-commerce prices, then the change management requirements are not particularly onerous. But if we are expecting sales teams to adopt value-based selling or new price guidance, then having the right change management in place becomes more important. And some companies have strong internal teams geared up for this. Other companies may consider bringing in some short-term temporary resources, because it's very important to make sure that the change management tasks are sufficiently resourced. And in my experience, it doesn't necessarily work to give it to people that have a lot going on in their day job already, because they're always the first ones that don't get done. So then the next question is, do the target users have sufficient bandwidth? So we talked a little bit about whether there's anything else going on at the same time that will impact their focus on our pricing initiative. But it's very closely linked with how to choose the initial scope to increase the likelihood of adoption. And this is an example of a set of criteria that we've used with a number of customers to help decide on what's the first pilot of a new pricing initiative. So whether it's a business unit, whether it's a geography, whether it's a certain number of product categories, what's the right choice to make so that we can get going with an initial scope, a first pilot, that ensures we get good user adoption, that we deliver our return on investment, and that we have a good early win to communicate to the rest of the business to get traction around our pricing initiative. And not surprisingly, it covers many of the points we've discussed already. For example, is the portion of the business case that would be delivered big enough to make it an important early win? Is there good local support from senior stakeholders? Are there any conflicting initiatives in play? Is master data and IT architecture in line with our vision of the to be? So it's very important that we choose the landing point, the land, considering all of these barriers and making sure that we're landing in a place where we have obviously the most likely probability of success. And finally, we need a plan to drive adoption and value. And PROS has a customer adoption program in place that is designed to move users up this pyramid. So starting off with deploying the pricing initiative, having users in the solution and infusing it into their business processes, and basically adopting the processes so that the usage of the solution is in line with the best practices that we're putting in place, and we're really driving that adoption. That will then result in the KPI improvement that we're expecting from the pricing initiative, and that will ultimately deliver our return on investment. So it enables us to measure usage versus adoption and use this to help promote more adoption by showing a correlation between those users that are adopting the processes and a positive impact on the project's KPIs. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much. And I think that we've got time for some questions, Malika.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks a lot. Okay, so yes, we have 2 minutes. I have 2 questions. We'll see what we can do with that. First question for you, Nick. In your experience, what is the most common data issue that delays pricing initiatives?
So I think the most common one, and it's because it's kind of the most significant, is the one where there are different data structures in place across different geographies, different business units, and therefore some work needs to be done to align on a common product hierarchy, a common customer structure, a common way of describing customers. That's the one that most often causes delays, and it's typically associated with a very disparate ERP architecture, like lots of different ERP systems, different instances, etc. And so, you know, that's where in the past we've started with a land in an area that has the desired like corporate new product hierarchy, customer hierarchy. And so we start there, and at the same time, there's a parallel project underway to address data issues in some of the other geographies and some of the other business units.
Okay, thank you. Let's try to squeeze that last one. Any good tips for driving adoption from sales teams? I think you touched on that. And related to that question, I have another one, which is how can I get more information on the customer adoption program? 2 questions in one.
Yeah, 2 questions in one. So any tips for driving adoption from sales teams? So I've heard some good tips from, you know, when you attend pricing conferences, you hear from lots of different people, and you can always pick up good ideas. And one good idea I picked up was in training the sales teams to adapt, you know, new negotiation tactics, new negotiation strategies, using the company's procurement team to work with the sales team in kind of role play scenarios. So you've got, even from within the internal organization, you've got a good idea of the type of things that the purchasing guys, that the sales team are going to come in front of, what their mindset is and how they approach negotiations. So bringing those two parts of the organization together in role plays, I thought was a particularly good idea to help, drive the new behaviors that we're looking for. And yeah, it's just reach out to me, to pros generally, to find out more information about our customer adoption program.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for joining us. Our next session, as you can see, will be on January 17, and we hope to see you there, but you will receive more details soon about this next session. So yeah, thanks again, and I wish you all a good day.